Well, thank you everybody for coming. My name is Sujin Chong, founder of Climate Bridge Korea, New York, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I'm not sure where you are all now, but I'm in Vietnam, leaving for the US tonight, transferring in Seoul. I have been always away for almost 4 weeks, and I'm ready to go home. I had wonderful meetings in Korea with climate startups and investors, and there's so much that we can do with Climate Bridge Korea, New York. I'm going home very excited. Today, we have the honor of having TD Lowe as our speaker, who will explain how to secure funding, strategize for growth, and lead your startup to success. You can ask questions throughout the webinar. Please drop your questions in the chat box. TD will hold our question sessions in between the topics and at the end of the sessions. Oh my gosh, her simple bio is not simple, as she has achieved so much. TD is a managing partner at 425 Ventures, funding and coaching startup founders. She's a head coach at Usher and Keith, specializing in financing, strategy, and leadership. Her tech career has impacted tens of thousands of startups, raising billions in investments. Her experience spans technology strategy, finance, innovation, and venture capital. She's an investor in residence at Elemental Accelerator, guiding climate-focused founders. She's also an investor coach for Morgan Stanley Sustainable Solutions Collaborative. As director at Startup Grind, she launched a global startup exhibition reaching over 1 million entrepreneurs. She drove municipal innovations at San Francisco Lead for Living Cities and contributed to 500 startups. She's a former teaching faculty at SMU Digital Accelerator, guest speaker at Stanford, and co-founder of Innovating Women. She was named one of the 15 most influential graduates of the new millennial at the University of Alabama. With that, here's TD Lowe.
Well, good morning. It is such a pleasure to meet everyone, and it's such a pleasure anytime I have the opportunity to share with a group of founders and entrepreneurs and people who are in the ecosystem. It is the joy of my life. So on today, we're going to start by looking at some of the basic foundational principles of capital and what it takes to really be able to fundraise and learning what to do and what not to do in that process. So just to set an agenda for the day, I always like to start with an icebreaker. I feel like an icebreaker gives us an opportunity to be able to share with one another and to set the tone so that we know that throughout the entire process, we can engage and it's not just a one-way conversation. So on today, I always like to start with what I call emoji your mood. And so if you'll take to your chat, the chat section of Zoom, and if you'll place there an emoji that signifies your mood today and share with the whole group where you are. And so if you can see, this is my mood. I'm always so excited to be here and to have the opportunity to share with founders. I feel like there's no greater responsibility for those of us who've learned in the industry along the way than to share with others how to be able to navigate the fundraising process. So if you'll share your mood, Sujin, if you'll see if there are any that are interesting or any that you feel to highlight, feel free to highlight those. And then I will continue on to our introduction. So we're going to begin by talking a bit about capital strategy. So what is really a capital strategy? It's the baseline intelligence that's needed to navigate the entire process. That covers everything from how to build a correct data room, understanding the types of capital that are available, and then assessing whether those forms of capital are optimal for your business, whether you're a for-profit business, a nonprofit business, or if you're a hybrid entity. So let's start with the basics of your data room. The basics of the data room, you always want to make sure that your company establishment documents are there. Those are the documents that show an investor how the company was formed, under what legal entity, under what state or province or region or country your company was formed. The second thing are your founder agreements. The reason founder agreements are so important is because it gives investors insight into who is really driving the organization, who's in charge, and how that ownership has been allocated accordingly. It also ensures that investors know that as founders, you've been very forward thinking about how to capitalize on the ownership of the company. Another big one is the ESOP. And oftentimes, founders who are early on don't have an employee stock option plan already in place. But the importance of having an employee stock option plan in place is it as well communicates to your investors that you have thought very clearly about how to allocate the equity and the capital of the company. You want to make sure that you are thinking ahead about any employees if you're early stage. If you're further along, you want to think about how your employee stock option plan can help you be able to leverage and to bring on additional team members, as well as your financial documents in your capitalization table. One of the things that we do and we really focus in on at Fortify when it comes to a founder's data room is it's extremely important that you understand your IP strategy. And what we mean by IP strategy, that's intellectual property. Your intellectual property and the things that you do to either significantly own the intellectual property around your product, service, or good that you are producing, as well as how you're leveraging that intellectual property to create value. And we'll talk about that later. So these are some of the things that we really, as an investor, that you should really lean into as a founder, because this is what investors will expect to be a part of your data room. So now let's talk about the types of capital. You have your dilutive capital and your non-dilutive capital. At Fortify, we are investors from a dilutive capital standpoint. We are an institution that actually give capital in exchange for equity in the company. So for dilutive capital, it's the issuing of securities like stocks or convertible bonds, which results in the reduction of the existing shareholders' ownership. Remember, we talked at the beginning about your data room, and we talked about your founder agreement. That shareholder ownership includes your founders and any other shareholders within the company. So as an investor, as a VC, when we come in and we invest, it dilutes the overall ownership of the company. Whereas non-dilutive capital, this is financing or capital that has zero impact on the existing ownership of the shareholders. This includes a number of things. So let's dive into what is really dilutive capital. As I've already mentioned, as venture capitalists as we are at Fortify Ventures, dilutive capital falls into three different categories. You have either your value investors, your impact investors, and your strategic investors. If we talk a bit about what an impact investor really means, especially in sustainability and climate, which is where we do a lot of our work, impact investment is goodwill investment where the returns are measured in the impact that's achieved. Whereas with strategic and corporate investors, it's a partner investor whose existing company or entity gains from your particular company and by making that investment into your company. And then a value investor, these are the investors that we typically approach, the ones who are motivated by returns and by financial gains. So we may say, well, is that the gamut of all capital, dilutive capital that's available? No, there's always angel capital, and that capital comes from high net worth individuals or people that you know who have a lot of capital that individually they can invest. And then you have as well friends and family capital, both of which will dilute the ownership of the company. Whereas non-dilutive capital, as we've already discussed, has zero impact whatsoever on the company ownership, meaning that utilizing company grants or federal grants, competitions and prizes, and government partnerships oftentimes offer companies the ability to have access to capital with no dilution to ownership. There are some positives and some negatives that can be associated with non-dilutive capital, especially around grants, because you have to be sure that you select and acquire grants that don't divert the focus and the attention of your company, as well as non-governmental organizations. They do competitions and prizes as well. One thing to mention here in the US, especially in the US market, we have something that's called CRA, and that's Community Reinvestment Act. And those monies are monies that our banks make available through loans, no interest loans, to companies who are within the community and providing community good. So these are the various forms of capital. So looking at what stage of a company you are, it will depend on how much capital you can raise, what investors will expect at that stage of raise. If you're pre-money, pre-seed, you've raised no capital whatsoever, you're just beginning, this is where you'll find yourself in that friends or family range of capital that you're seeking. Whereas once you reach a pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, and beyond, this is where you're able to tap into a lot more of the dilutive capital. That capital that we've already talked about, that's from your strategic, your impact, and your value investors. At pre-seed and seed stage, there are certain expectations that an investor will have. An investor will expect there to be a solid thesis or a solid both problem and solution. Problem and solution associated with the market that you're participating in. Whereas when you get to a late stage in Series A, there's a lot more that is required around the traction of a company. So your focus with raising capital from seed and Series A and beyond has to really be driven by what you do as a company, how well you're performing as a company, and what your metrics look like. So as you're raising capital, oftentimes founders find themselves in a position where we've raised a seed, we've raised either a Series A or a Series B, and we realize, well, we don't have enough capital to get to the next round. And so you oftentimes hear founders say, well, we need to raise a bridge or we need to raise an extension. There are both positives as well as challenges around raising a bridge. So what I always tell founders, if you find yourself somewhere in between, your seed, your Series A, your Series B, and beyond, it becomes really imperative that you're very clear on how you communicate to founders, or excuse me, to investors, why you're raising the money, why the previous money that you raised did not get you to your stated previous objectives. Because obviously, if you're raising a bridge, typically 99% of the time when companies are raising a bridge, it's because there are issues with capital to operate the company. Now, I will say that I have experienced one company, just one out of all the companies that I've worked with over my career, that they were raising a bridge simply because they had so much demand for their previous round, and it was going to be another 2 years given their runway before they even started their next raise, that they opened a bridge just to allow investors that they respected and that they wanted to be in the investment into the round. But typically a bridge can be very tricky for founders because previously, say you've raised a Series A, you've communicated to investors with that previous Series A raise that you were going to accomplish a certain set of goals. And when you reach a point where you don't have enough capital to accomplish those goals, raising a bridge tells an investor that somehow you didn't quite meet the mark. And it becomes a very delicate situation for a founder to be able to communicate to investors, well, hey, we need more money. There are many things that can attribute to that. Obviously, the change in the macro environment can cause, a founder to need more capital, but it's those changes in the micro environment, meaning your handling and your management of the company that are the biggest hurdles for founders in raising that bridge. So in raising a bridge, you have to be really careful to not further over dilute the company. So here are some things to really think about when raising a bridge. You want to be careful to understand and be sure you know what the dilution impact is going to be. Because in a situation where you're raising a bridge, that means in between two rounds, you're going to have to give more leverage, unfortunately, to investors, whether they are existing investors or new investors, which means that it's going to impact the complete ownership or the shareholder ownership of the company. The next thing, as I've already touched on, are your investment milestones. It means that you're going to have to be really, really, really careful about how you communicate what your milestones are that you're planning to deliver with the bridge, and how you're going to avoid the desperation of finding yourself in a position of needing more cash before you get to that next raise and achieve those milestones. It's also imperative that when you are raising funds, especially raising a bridge, that you're completely honest with where you are as a company and communicate that clearly to your investors. And the last and probably most important thing is when you're seeking a bridge, you're already in a position where somewhere operationally your goals and your cash don't match. So you want to make sure that you're communicating the common interests, whether it's to your existing investors, making sure that they know we're doing this such that we're taking care of the capital that you've already given us, such that we can continue to grow. And to on new investors that you may bring into the bridge, you want to be sure to communicate the interest that they would share in helping you to further your objective in the growth of the company. So now that we have an understanding of, what types of capital are there, what is expected for you at a particular stage of investment, and what happens if you somehow run out of the cash that you've planned at each round, it's really important for you to think about, as founders, how do we select our investors? What really matters when it comes time to make a decision about who an investor should be? Now, early on, when you're starting out, and you're a pre-seed company and you're very young, you maybe even be prior to acquiring a customer, you have to be a little less scrutinizing about your investors, because a lot of times that money is going to come from friends and family and people that you know. Whereas when you're moving along to your actual seed, Series A, you have to really consider the industry knowledge of your investor. If you are a climate tech company and you're seeking funding from an investor who has no knowledge whatsoever of the climate tech environment, you're going to have a much more difficult time of explaining to them what you do, how you do it, and why it's important that they invest. You also want to make sure that your investors have skill and expertise in an area to really be able to help you as founders navigate the process, not just with the capital that you receive with them, but the capital that you will seek within their network. And that's why a strong network matters. One of the things that we did very early at Fortify Ventures was, long before we ever wrote our first check, we spent probably a year and a half doing absolutely nothing but building the network that would be necessary for our founders to succeed. So a strong network is imperative in order to ensure that you're making the right selection for the investors that you want. You also want to make sure that your investors have a proven track record, not just of writing a check, but a proven track record of being able to help founders at your stage be able to take the capital, be able to execute it effectively, and then ultimately be able to continue to grow. And those investors will become ultimately a springboard or a springboard platform for everything that you will do in the future of your company. So given that we now understand what you should do when it comes time to selecting your investor, the appropriate instruments that are utilized in this process are just as important. There are typically, especially for early stage companies, two instruments that are utilized. That's a convertible note or a SAFE, a simple agreement for future equity. SAFEs were created by Y Combinator. I don't know if everyone here knows who Y Combinator is, but Y Combinator is one of the premier incubators here in the US. They've been around maybe 15, 20 years now, and they have produced just, I would say, close to 95% of all the unicorns that have come out of the tech market in the US. And because because seeking investment can be very complex, they developed this very simple instrument to be able to acquire capital without having to do a lot of the legal paperwork that is required. So the difference between a convertible note and a convertible note is debt, whereas a safe is equity. And so understanding the difference between the two will either help you better navigate the future plans for capital, as well as help you understand as a founder how your company will be diluted at each event that triggers the conversion of either that note or that safe. Convertible notes are debt and safes are equity. And one of the challenges that founders face when taking on a lot of safes and convertible notes early on, it can provide sort of a cloud, or it can skew your vision of how your company is being diluted. So I use something typically that's called the rule of fifths with companies when it comes to taking on capital around convertible notes and safes. And what it does is it helps you to understand how quickly your company can or will be diluted by taking on safes. I'll dive in a little bit more to what the rule of fifths is as we progressed. And then the third and final instrument is your typical traditional priced rounds. That requires you to obviously have a legal team, an accounting team to be able to legally navigate this process. It's a lot more complex, and it typically happens after the seed stage of a company. So I'm going to pause there for a second before we talk about the financial pillar and give everyone a chance to kind of digest what we've talked about. We've opened by talking about what is required from an investor from a data room perspective. What does it look like to select the type of investor based off of where you sit in your industry? Is it, if you're a climate company, is it an impact investor that you should seek? Is it a strategic investor? Is it a traditional value investor? What are some of the things that you should utilize in order to select your investors? And then what type of investment, meaning based off of the instrument that you're going to use to raise the capital, makes sense for you as a company. So moving on to the financial pillar. When you look at financial strategy, it's industry standard documentation that is imperative for investors to really understand a company's business model. As much as your company's pitch is the narrative for the company, your financials will corroborate all of the claims that you make in your pitch. So before you ever get to a pitch deck, before we even get there, we have to ensure that the basics of your financial strategy are in place. And the basics are your pro forma. Your pro forma is nothing more. I know a lot of people say, well, we could use a P&L. That's sure, you could do a P&L, but for most companies, if you're early on, you might not truly have revenue in place. So a pro forma can give an investor a really good insight into how you think about your business model. Obviously, your cap table matters. Your runway, meaning how much capital you have on hand to actually execute on the objectives. The valuation, meaning the value of your company, and the term sheets. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into what your pro forma is. A pro forma is a financial statement that outlines the projected performance of a company. It gives investors insight into how you make decisions as a founder, your understanding of how to go to market, how to grow your company, the industry, your unit economics of your company, as well as all of the financial planning, and whether or not it will demonstrate whether or not you can show to an investor that this company has a high probability or potential for growth. Your capitalization table is a ledger or a record of the document, or excuse me, it documents the ownership or the record for the company's assets. This is really, really important. Just anecdotally, I've had founders be at the table with an investor, raising capital, going in to finalize the deal at 8 a.m., and me getting a 1 a.m. emergency call saying, we have a problem with our cap table. Our previous co founder, we gave equity to, and it's still on the cap table, and we can't get him to give it back. And I hate to see that happen to companies. And there I was at 1 a.m. in the morning helping a bunch of Wharton grads. These are people who graduated from Penn Wharton. They have, an amazing MBA, and they did not know that they could not go into raising funds with having that hiccup on their cap table. So it's important that you keep an accurate ledger, and that ledger tells an investor who are the contributors to the company, both from sweat equity and capital. So make sure your cap tables are clean. We talked a bit about runway. Runway is the amount of time you have before your company runs out of operating capital. This is a big one. Like I always encourage founders, and at Fortify, we make this a really big thing, is that on a weekly basis, you should be reviewing your runway. You should almost be obsessive about understanding how much cash that you have to keep the company functioning and operating. So your runway is simply your total cash balance divided by the average monthly operating expense. Now, obviously, this is a moving target because as you're growing as a company, you're making revenue, so revenue's coming back into the company. So your cash balance, it's always a right now, real-time snapshot of what your runway is. It's very important as founders that you keep that at the forefront of your mind. So how do you manage the runway? Because the runway is the difference between your company thriving or your company dying. We talked earlier about raising a bridge. The reason companies 99% of the time are raising a bridge is because somewhere along the way, their runway is getting shorter and shorter, and they cannot accomplish their goals. So managing your runway requires you as a founder to obviously be astute about your revenue, understand what's happening around how you're driving revenue within the organization, and being willing to pivot to do the things that really will drive revenue. Controlling your cost as well is a really big factor in controlling your runway, as well as making sure from the beginning, when you're deciding on how much capital to bring into the company, that there's a very clear understanding of how much investment is needed to accomplish the goals that you've set out. One of the things as well that we do at Fortify for the companies that we do invest in before they begin their next round, we take them through an analysis of understanding how much they really should be raising, not what is the vanity amount, that TechCrunch says you should raise, but the actual amount that you need in order to achieve and accomplish the goals that you've set out and to meet the objectives to get to your next stage of growth. So understanding that from the beginning, raising the right amount of capital is so integral to ensuring that you're managing your runway effectively. So what are some of the negative impacts of failure to manage that runway? Obviously, it's over dilution, meaning you as founders losing ownership of the company. As well, your valuation. Every founder wants their company's valuation to continue to grow, to continue to thrive, to continue to, if we know the Moore's Law curve, to be up and to the right. That's what every founder wants. But when you fail to manage your runway, it has a direct impact on your valuation. It also impacts your ability to be able to negotiate with investors. Obviously, when you're raising funds, you should as a founder want to put a lot of emphasis on taking care of the company ownership, because the company ownership allows you to be rewarded in the long run, as well as all of your employees and everyone who are stakeholders in the company. So if you don't manage your runway correctly, it inhibits your ability to be able to negotiate the terms that you want for capital, and ultimately it stifles the company's growth. No one wants that. So here are a couple of things that you want to keep in mind and proceed cautiously with to help manage your runway. Avoid waste. You have to run very leanly as a startup. Although, it's easy to think, well, we raised $3 million, we should go get a fancy office and buy Herman Miller chairs and do all these things that are great and nice to have, but that may or may not necessarily add to your growth metrics. You want to avoid waste in such a way as a founder that every dollar that is being allocated within the organization can be directly tied to creating value for the company. The next thing is, don't hire too soon. This is a thing that I see a lot of founders do. They raise capital, and the first thing they do is they go hire 4 people, and those 4 people really aren't adding value back to the company. You should feel the pain before you make that hire. The next thing is managing your unit economics. This is a really big thing, because managing your unit economics not only helps you as a company, but it helps you communicate to your investor that you're very savvy and that you're very responsible and you're a very good steward over the investments that you've received, such that when you're seeking further capital, they can have confidence in the fact that writing a check, you're going to create even more value. So we talked a lot about value. Why does value matter? Well, valuation is the monetary value that's attributed to your company, and it's determined by a composite of various things, meaning similar firms that are in your market, as well as a combination of what are the market sentiments around what's happening in your industry sector. So a lot of valuation can be seen as subjective. But there are certain things that we do at Fortify to help companies identify where those objective and the objectivity exists around valuation. So when we talk about valuation in and of itself, it's also important to understand that as you're thinking about your company's valuation, it informs what you should expect in a term sheet. Oftentimes, when you receive a term sheet from an investor, valuation is going to weigh heavy, because in that term sheet, it's going to determine how much capital an investor is willing to give you in exchange for the amount of equity. And that is a direct calculation of the valuation of the company. So here are a couple of things that you want to really think about when you start to dive in to a term sheet that you've received from an investor. Obviously, the valuation is going to be important, because all of these things either positively or can negatively impact the company's valuation. Understanding an investor's voter, what is the voting agreement in a term sheet? What rights do an investor have around, casting a vote for what happens around the investment and the direction of the company, as well as the purchase agreement? What are the investor's rights? Pro rata, that's a really big one. Pro rata simply means what an investor, after an investor has invested, for all future investments, what rights are you giving them to all of your future investments, as well as the right of first refusal. These kind of go hand in hand with pro rata, but the right of first refusal simply means that before any other investor has a chance to come in beyond that round, you have to give that investor first consideration. And then what is an investor's liquidation preference? Liquidation preference means what happens in the event that the company either sells or is acquired or goes through an IPO and is listed on a market exchange. How does the investor themselves benefit from that process? So I'm going to pause here. There's so much that we could discuss around the financial strategy, especially a term sheet, that alone is a class in and of itself, diving into all of the pieces of the term sheet. Are there any questions
Actually, I just had a question about the SAFE.
Yes,
The SAFE is a very new instrument for Korean investors. So they just
yes.
started to accept it. So people are not fully aware of it and what the consequences are, how this instrument is being utilized. So if you can elaborate a little bit on that, that'll be very helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, absolutely. So, with a convertible note versus a safe, we've already discussed that a convertible note is debt and a safe is equity. And so, basically, how a safe works is, and without having to go through all of the legal parameters, it allows an investor to say, "This is how much we are willing to invest in your company," but they set a cap, like a ceiling of how much capital can come in under that safe. And basically, the safe says that we will give you this amount in exchange for some future equity stake in the company. Some of the challenges of that is at the time that you take the safe, you don't necessarily know how much equity that will be. And the amount of equity won't be known until the safe actually converts. And that safe does not convert until you go to your next round of investment. And so the challenge with the safe, although it's quick, it's easy, I always caution founders to keep the amount of money that they take under a safe beneath $5 million. Now, I will say that that threshold can move sometimes depending on the size of the industry that you're in, what your actual valuation is as a company, as well as what is your future market potential. But typically keeping your safes at 5 million and below, it will really help you to not over dilute the company early on. At going from a seed, everything from a seed to a pre-seed to a seed stage company in Series A, you want to try to manage your dilution to keep it at 25% or less. And so with a safe, it can be really challenging if you get above $5 million to really know what you know and understand how your company will be diluted at the next round of investment. And Rick, I think you have your hand raised.
Yes, thanks. Great presentation, by the way. I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail on valuation and the use of comparables. And
Yes.
early stage companies have a tough time. They usually undervalue their worth or overvalue it, but getting it right there where it should be is usually difficult.
It is very difficult. I will tell you that valuation is probably one of my passions because one of the things that we do at Fortify is we talked about, the subjective and the objective when it comes to valuation. And that is the industry way of saying it. At Fortify, we speak to valuation as your internal versus your external valuation. The external valuation, Rick, to your point, are those market indicators, meaning what are other companies in the space, doing? How are they performing? How much did they raise? What were the terms of their raise? What is happening in the industry as a whole? Is the industry on an upward trend or is the industry on a downward trend? Is the industry, overly segmented? Is the industry going through, a conglomeration or a coming together or a merging? Is there mass merging in the industry? These are all of the external things that inform investors on what we feel, because it's kind of like doing your finger in the air to feel the wind. As investors, it gives us some sense of where we feel you should land as a company where your valuation is concerned. Whereas internal valuation is something that you as a founder, and we teach this at Fortify, that you as a founder, you can drive your valuation. You can be the determinant of what your valuation is. And so we train on how to be able to do that effectively as a founder. And so I hope, Rick, that answers your question. Some of the things with the internal valuation are obviously around, your IP, how you're performing operationally. And there are other levers that you have the ability to pull and to activate that can drive your valuation higher.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Any other questions about our financial strategy before we dive into the messaging strategy? Perfect. So you probably remember me saying before that your financials are the underbelly or the foundation of what substantiates your messaging. So the messaging strategy is designed to help founders craft and deliver a narrative about their product that's meaningful and compelling to an investor. This is completely different than a PR message, meaning the message that you're going to put out to market the company. This is completely different than a sales message, meaning the messaging that you are delivering to your customers to acquire them. Your messaging for investment, it should elevate the tenets that investors rely on in the decision-making process. So how do we do that? There are a series of things that we should accomplish as founders around the messaging strategy. That's your pitch deck preparation, your pitch preparation, obviously your investor meeting preparation, and lastly, and probably most importantly, is negotiation. We talked about everything before in your capital and your financial pillars because it all sets the stage for you to be able to negotiate effectively. So let's dive right into your pitch preparation. One of the things to know about preparing a pitch deck, it's important that you know your audience. Every deck isn't going to be the same. And as we've spoken earlier, to what types of investors exist, you have your value, your impact, and your strategic investors. Depending on the type of investor, it's going to inform the narrative and the approach that you're going to take as you're delivering a pitch deck to that particular investor. So you have to know your audience. The second thing is, this is not Lord of the Rings, where one ring rules them all. It's not that way with the deck. You can't just create one deck and that deck be the final deck for every investor or for every situation. As a founder, you have to know how to be able to deliver a message at the right time to the right people with the right information. So you should have a minimal 3 different types of decks. You should have an intro deck. This is a deck that you will simply email to investors or to potential investors that becomes sort of like a teaser to say, hey, this is what we're doing. We're seeking capital. We'd love to have a dialogue with you about this. The shared deck is the deck that you ultimately provide to an investor that provides a lot of the detail around what's happening with the company. It goes a lot deeper into how the company performs, what is the problem and the solution that you're solving, what is the market that you're tackling, how are you doing it, how are you looking to allocate the funds. This is the deck that we typically think about when we think this is the deck we want to email to an investor. That's different, however, than the deck you're going to use when you're standing in front of an investor and you're pitching. And a pitch deck should be light on verbiage because you don't want anything to distract from you delivering the message of who and what the company does. So let's dive a bit into your pitch preparation. Now that you understand that you have 3 decks that you should think about, you've got to have the intro deck. That's the one that's just simply, hey, we exist. This is what we do. We'd love to have a conversation. You have, obviously, as we mentioned before, your shared deck, the one that's going to provide all the detail, and then your pitch deck. This is the pitch deck is the one that you will use to actually stand before the investor and pitch your company. In preparation for that, the same rule applies. You must know your audience. I also tell founders, practice a conversational approach to your pitch. It is so awful. I hate when I have founders who come and it sounds like a robot is talking to me. You could record that and just email that to an investor. If I'm talking to a founder and I'm asking them to pitch me, it's because I want to get a sense of who you are as a founder. I want to understand why this is really important. Why are you really building this company? And I want to hear the passion, and I want to hear the true authenticity of who you are behind the product. So practice a true conversational approach to your pitch. And what I said before, use your pitch deck and not your shared deck when you're actually pitching an investor. Because the last thing that you want is for an investor to have to read a slide that has 300 words on that slide while you're trying to talk to them, because you've bifurcated their focus. So you're now losing your audience. So you want to make sure every time you're pitching an investor, you're using the pitch deck. You want to show less on that deck and tell more, because you are the focal point when you're pitching. And then the last one, practice, practice, and practice some more. One of the things that we do at Fortify, and I love this, is when we have companies that we are preparing to go and pitch for their next round of investment, and my niece is much older now, but we started out years ago using a group of 12-year-olds and having our founders pitch to them. And I know you're thinking, why would we have a group of founders pitch to 12-year-olds, especially 12-year-old girls? Because if you can pitch your product, your service, or your good to a 12-year-old and they understand what you're doing, you will have no trouble whatsoever pitching to an investor. And so you have to pitch, practice, practice, practice. So important. Find someone who knows nothing about your product, about your service, or your good, and those are the people that you practice your pitch on. So when you're actually preparing for that investor meeting, there are some things that are important to keep at the forefront of your mind. You want to set realistic outcomes. There very few times do we as humans go on a first date and expect to get married on a first date. That's very rare that we do that. So you should approach your investor meeting the same way. When going into an investor meeting, you shouldn't go in with the expectation of having the check written the very day that you sit and you speak to an investor. Has it happened? Sure. But it happens so very rarely. The purpose is you want to get the next meeting or the second date, if you will. You want to understand the important things. And the important things are what matters to the investor. How can I speak to those things and as I'm delivering what we do as a company that are important to an investor? Again, you want to use your pitch deck and not your shared deck. And this is the opportunity when you're before your investor that you're going to show more about your product. Meaning you can give them pictures, but if you have a product or a service or something that's tangible that they can touch, you want to make sure you're showing that and demonstrating that in your actual investor meeting. So moving on to yes, I'll pause before we go to negotiation. Rick?
I would just add that in your first meeting, I would research the investors quite a bit and ask who's going to be at the meeting, because many investors will let their interns fill a room and learn, and really get anything out of the first meeting, maybe first two meetings. So research who's going to be at the meeting and what the expectations are.
Absolutely. 1,000%. 1,000%. And that's important, Rick, because it helps set the stage as you progress in your meetings with investors for how you should approach your negotiation. Because if you understand who's in the room and you understand who the decision makers are, and those are the ones that you obviously want to pitch, it gives you more insight into how you negotiate. So let's just briefly, and we're going to go through this quickly, touch on the science of negotiation. We talked earlier about some of those points in a term sheet that are important for you as a founder. And we talked a bit about liquidation preference. In the event of a liquidation, meaning an IPO or the company is acquired, the investor will have certain amount of the investment returned to them based on the multiples that were agreed upon on the term sheet and the final agreement. So you want to make sure that these are points that you really dial in when you're thinking about what you're going to negotiate. This happens after you've gotten through the first date. Now you're in your second or third meeting and you're now talking about, yes, we want to commit to each other. And because an investment is a 10-year commitment minimum between you and that investor. And so you're now at a place of saying, here is what we want the terms of our partnership to look like. So when it comes to negotiation, I use this rule: don't give more than 5 minutes to any point of negotiation that has less than a year impact on your company. If it has less than a year impact on your company, move on. Focus on the big things. And the big things are liquidation preference. And we can hear in this example, and I'll make sure with Sujin that we share this example because it really gives a detailed example. In this example, a company raises 5%, $5 million with 50% common stock with 2.5 million preferred shares on a 1x preference in full participation. There's a lot of terminology in here that we don't have time today to really dive into, but just to show you that in a liquidation, this company sells for $15 million. And at the end of it, the common shareholders, meaning the founders, only end up with 6.25 million of the 15 million that the company sells for. Why is that? Because if you don't negotiate all those things around your liquidation preference correctly, it can over dilute the company and keep you in a place as a founder where majority of what you've earned in this sell actually ends up in the hands of your investors. The next thing or point of negotiation is participation. And this is a method that investors use to increase their returns. As an investor, it's a great thing. As a founder, it's something that you should really keep in mind. Full participation entitles an investor to both the liquidation preference as well as proceeds and anything else that's converted after that. So it's like it gives an investor the opportunity to double dip. Whereas non-participation, it's either the liquidation preference or you get the upside when the shares are converted. This is an example of participation carrying over from the previous example. Say, for instance, an investor had full participation. You've already sold for $15 million, and the $6.25 million, here at the bottom, is what the remaining proceeds were. If an investor had full participation, they're going to get an additional $625,000 out of this investment, meaning that the total returns for the VCs in this example of the $15 million is $9.375 million. And that leaves, less than, just a little over $5 million for the founders. And then the last point of negotiation is around discount, really understanding the percentage of discount that you're giving investors for future rounds of investment. So that means if you give a 10% discount in the next round, your investors, whereas your new investors are purchasing at $1, your previous investors are purchasing at 90 cents per share, which means that you're giving up more equity of the company. So you want to make sure that as you're negotiating, that these are points that you're negotiating. And then ultimately, the valuation cap. This is a big one. And this is a class that if I taught valuation cap, it would be like a week-long class because it is that complex. But the valuation cap allows investors to convert their investment effectively at a lower price per share. A lot of times founders tout their valuation caps as being a positive, but it's important to understand whether that valuation cap is pre or post money and how that's calculated. And then ultimately it's important because high valuation caps can as well accelerate the dilution of founders in later rounds. So you want to make sure it goes right back to us talking about earlier, raising the right amount on the right terms, at the right terms, such that the company is well cared for. And here's an example of valuation cap. So a company raises $10 million from a previous safe with a $5 million cap. And the total number of outstanding shares, just for simplicity, is $10 million. So your safe holder is guaranteed to purchase at no higher than the cap. So for instance, the market price is $1 per share, whereas the safe price per share is 50 cents. So the safe holder gets a 50% discount, or they're getting a 2-for-1, if you will, on the purchase price of those shares. So that's accelerating the dilution of the founder's ownership, as well as all of the employees' stake in the ownership as well. So it's important that we really focus on those things when we think about negotiation. And then lastly, once you've negotiated the deal, you've taken care of all of those points, here are the things that you need to know to finalize and close that deal. You want to be extremely responsive to all of the due diligence questions that an investor asks. I can't tell you how off-putting it is as an investor when you're really excited about a company and you want to write a check and you've sent them a list of questions to answer, and it's a week later and you hear nothing from them. It will sour the deal. As well as for a founder, it's important for you to set a close date. Understand, where you're thinking that you want to have your round finished and completed. Because what it does is it lets the investor know that this is not a never-ending fundraise, that ultimately that you intend to close this and that you have objectives that you clearly are setting to achieve. And so plan your options. Meaning if you say, oh, I want to raise venture, and you don't find institutional investors who are really excited about getting there, and you can't get other institutional investors or venture capitalists to join the round, you want to make sure that you have other investors in your back pocket who can come on board to help you close that round. And then the last and probably most important thing is upfront, have your legal documents in place. There's nothing more frustrating than being at the end of closing a deal and as an investor figuring out the founders don't have their legal documents together. And it's like, it makes you as an investor want to walk away. So ultimately, these are the things that you'd want to do as a founder from the beginning of understanding your capital strategy, your financial strategy, and your messaging strategy to help simplify and increase your probability of raising capital. Are there any questions? Now that we've covered everything, and I know we're 5 minutes over, I appreciate everyone's patience and their grace in going over 5 minutes. And I think, Rick, we have a question.
Not a question, just a comment. I would suggest that before talking with any venture capitalists, I spent plenty of time on Sand Hill, I would always go towards, I would always seek strategic investors first, people who can bring sales or sales channels to the table rather than just money, and know your industry and have additional interest in why they're making the investment.
Absolutely. That is a very salient point, Rick. And a lot of times I find that, in fact, one of the companies that we're working with right now is in that exact position. They just signed an LOI yesterday that gives them access to their strategic investors' facilities and some of their staff. So without even hiring anyone or having to pay for a building or pay for utilities or anything, they're getting all of those resources attributed to their organization. Any other questions?
If I may, I have seen a lot of startups when they're raising, they say I'm having a difficulty finding the lead. So everybody says,
Yes.
if you find the lead, I'll follow them. So do you have any tricks or any advice for finding a lead? Because I see that as a really practical problem for a lot of startups to start.
It is. In fact, I will be honest, finding the lead investor is probably the most challenging because you're going to always have followers. Everyone is, like, yeah, I'm on board too. But the lead investor in and of itself comes through relationship. It comes through keen introduction. It comes through really understanding your investor. And at Fortify, one of the things that we do is something called investor mapping that helps founders really be able to do this and do it successfully and reduce the time that it takes for them to get to funding. But you're right, Sujin, that is the biggest challenge. There is no magic formula to it. It just requires the grind and the hard work to get to that lead investor. Absolutely. But one of the things that you can do is if you have an idea of who you would want to be a lead investor, understanding who lives in their investor tree. And this is, something we do at Fortify. Understanding who lives in your investor tree can help you find that lead investor a lot faster.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I know we went through so many concepts that we do at Fortify that I just don't have time, in an hour to be able to cover everything. But you guys can always reach out to us at Fortify Ventures, and it's just TD at 425 Ventures with an S at the end of ventures.com. So you can always email us and reach out to us. We are always here to help and to assist. We are a firm that's very passionate about entrepreneurs and the success of entrepreneurs. So we don't just invest capital, we invest resources and guidance to ensure that founders are successful.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
You're so very welcome.
Of course, thank you. Thank you so much for everybody for joining, and you can always reach out to me or TD, as she said. We'll be happy to answer any questions in the future as well. This is just a starting point. I mean, TD is someone that I respect so much. The more you ask, you're going to get like so much out of her. So I would like to say utilize her. She's going to be very, very helpful going forward in your journey. Thank you so much again, TD.
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of announcements. We're having, New York is having a climate week. TD is going to be there. I'm going to be there. If anybody's joining, coming to the climate week, please let us know. I'm going to have a small gathering for Korean delegates or whatnot. So it will be great to have you. And also next week, we have another webinar coming up on September 4th. It's by the Kaufman Southern Tier Incubator. It's a hub for startups by Vandana Katok, Executive Director of Kaufman Southern Tier Incubator. She will tell you all about the benefits of being in New York State as a climate tech startup, all the supports that you can get. They have an amazing program. I hope you will all join and benefit from it. Thank you again for everything, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.